But first, we begin tonight with a frightening question. What if the next presidential election is already decided? What if the MAGA Republican-led House of Representatives decided to just steal the election on their own? We talk about democracy under threat a lot on this show because it is very much under threat. But we need to talk about, how real that threat is with someone like Speaker Mike Johnson at the helm. It's all outlined in a new op-ed by Tom Rogers, editor-at-large for Newsweek, who makes the case that the ability to manipulate an election outcome is far greater now than ever before. Rogers writes that the potential overturning of the upcoming 2024 election is even more plausible and dangerous than it was in 2020, because the Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is not only an election denier, but also a ringleader of the previous effort. Rogers quotes from a recent article published in the Washington Spectator, written by political veterans Mark Medish and Joel McCleary. The piece states that next to the election of the president, nothing is more important than the election of the new speaker, writing, quote, "The party controlling the speakership has the potential power to reverse the results of the presidential election and deliver the White House to itself." The piece outlines exactly how and why this should terrify Americans. In this dangerous scenario, the current election-denying Republican majority, in the days following the November elections, might decide that they are going to challenge the results of certain House races that Democrats won, just because they don't like the results. They don't like how the American people voted. Democracy be damned. And then, per this scenario, the current Republican majority could deny certification of enough Democratic election winners to preserve the Republican majority in the Congress. Once the Republicans have effectively stolen the House majority and elected a speaker, the next step in an election denial process would be to refuse to certify the Electoral College results of certain states, which would mean neither candidate gets to the 270 Electoral College votes needed to win. That would throw the election to the House of Representatives. And once the presidential race is thrown to the House, the president is chosen on a state-by-state delegation vote, a vote that in the current House makeup, Republicans would win. And Trump would be the president, regardless of whether a majority of Americans or even a majority of the Electoral College chose him. Now, of course, a major factor in this scenario is having a full cadre of election deniers who continue to claim that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president and that the 2020 election results should never have been certified, which, of course, Trump and his congressional flunkies continue to claim. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, for instance, once normie Republican and now full-fledged MAGA, which also explains how she's the fourth-ranking House Republican, would not even commit to certifying the 2024 election results during an interview with NBC's Kristen Welker.
What about 2024?
We will see if this is a legal and valid election.
But just to be very clear, I don't hear you committed to certifying the election results. Will you only commit to certify the results if former President Trump wins? Does that mean former President Trump wins?
No, it means if they are constitutional. What we saw in 2020 was unconstitutional circumventing of the Constitution.
Medish and McCleary write in their piece that good faith can no longer be assumed. That is certainly the case. Before Mike Johnson became Speaker, meaning before anyone knew who he was, the Louisiana congressman was a mouthpiece for wild conspiracy theories supporting the big lie. He then voted against certifying Biden's victory, even after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Mike Johnson isn't just an election-denying Republican speaker who could overturn a presidential election, as if that wasn't enough. He's a man with a two-seat majority who cannot pass a budget, but manages to secure enough Republican votes to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, simply because that is what Trump wants. He also has some intense Christian nationalist leanings.
I am a Bible-believing Christian. Someone asked me today in the media, they said, it's curious, people are curious, what does Mike Johnson think about any issue under the sun? I said, well, go pick up a Bible off your shelf and read it. That's my worldview. That's what I believe.
Okay, so his worldview, his views stem from his take on the Bible. Not a big deal if you're a civilian or a regular voter, but quite the problem when you're House Speaker and relying on your particular interpretation of a religious book to determine public policy, rather than, the Constitution. But also, Speaker Mike What was that part in the Bible about treating the foreigner as one of your own? Per Politico, Johnson delivered a presentation last weekend at a Republican retreat in Florida, which came off more like a sermon, according to two people in the room. Johnson contended that when one doesn't have God in their life, the government or the state will become their guide, referring back to Bible verses. One of the sources there wasn't having it. I'm not at church, they said, meaning Johnson is so far out there that even other Republicans are pushing back on the God talk. But this is why we need to be very concerned. Mike Johnson has the conviction, the motivation, and now the opportunity to steal the next election for Donald Trump. He is a far right-wing evangelical Christian who suggested his election as House Speaker was ordained literally by God, even billing himself as a modern-day Moses. So if God tells him to steal a few elections to make Trump president, what's he going to do? And then what happens if God tells him to make Trump president for life? Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California, and Michael Waldman, President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, and the author of The Supermajority: How the Supreme Court Divided America. Now, normally I would defer to the congressman first, but I'm going to apologize to Congressman Swalwell and come here to the table to Michael Waldman, because you wrote about this before. You have talked through this scenario. I think when folks saw that article in Newsweek, they thought that would never happen. Could that happen?
Well, we have learned that we need to be imaginative about what could be done, because things we never thought were possible happened in 2020 and before. And so we need to look at all these ways that, you know, in our country, unlike other democracies, there's no umpire who says, oh, yeah, this person won, that person won, neutral and respected.
Right.
It turns out to be this very slapdash system going back many years where you can manipulate things. Now, there's good news. Even Mike Johnson, even this election denier who no one ever heard of, who's now the speaker, is constrained by this law that was passed at the end of the last Congress, the Electoral Count Reform Act. It is harder for him to try to throw the election in that way than it would have been a few years ago. That's the good news. The bad news is we have to be really vigilant. For example, the attacks on these things have actually moved to the states. Right. You now have election deniers who've sort of wormed their way into jobs running elections in local areas. Now there's courts and there's laws and constitutions in the states that have stopped that kind of stuff up until now. But we need to be on our game. Anybody who cares about democracy between now and when the next president puts their hand on that Bible. Yeah,
I mean, Congressman Swalwell, here's the challenge. Pretty much everyone who is setting themselves up in their hope of being the next hang Mike Pence, which I don't know why anybody would want that job, since Donald Trump did try to get the last guy killed. But they all want to be president. They all want to be vice president with him, right? Here's Byron Donalds talking about whether he would support rejecting the 2024 result if Trump doesn't win.
I think Congress has a responsibility within the electoral process to be that last constitutional check on what happened in states. If there are issues where states were avoiding election procedures that were passed by the legislature, ignoring them out of hand, or if there was some clear subversion that was going on, members of Congress have a responsibility to speak to that.
So he's not the only one who talks that way, Congressman. Elise Stefanik, there's a reason Kirsten Welker asked her, are you saying you would refuse to certify the election unless Trump wins? She wouldn't answer. Ron DeSantis has said, well, Mike Pence did his duty, so we're not sure about him. Tim Scott would not answer the question. He wants to be vice president. Vivek Ramaswamy said, yeah, he would have certified, but Pence should have done some magical reforms. The others haven't really addressed it. But there are enough of them that are serving with you who've said,
Joy, Republicans don't any longer believe in the ideas of freedom and democracy. Those are the ideas that America was founded upon. They don't believe in an idea anymore of America. They believe in an idol, and that idol is Donald Trump. And when you talk about Speaker Johnson's faith, his faith doesn't concern me. Every American has a choice to follow a God or to not. But what should concern anyone of faith is that the first commandment in the Christian faith is to not follow any other gods, to just follow the Lord. And they have put everything into helping Donald Trump. They've taken our House and turned it into a law firm. And the professor would probably appreciate that the House is now the largest law firm in D.C. and they work every day for just one client. And it doesn't matter if that defies freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. They have put that idol above the idea of democracy.
Yeah, that is the first commandment. Thou shalt have no other God before me. Idolatry is actually a sin.